going to move us up to the top. And sorry, I wasn't on the right slide. Okay, we're starting now.
Okay, should I go?
Yeah.
Okay, so today we'll be talking about the women's and civil rights movement. I'm going to be specifically talking about the suffragettes. So next slide. So the first type of women's movement were the suffragettes, who would later be considered the first feminist movement. They protested and campaigned for women in the middle class to be able to vote and own property. The word suffragette came from the word suffrage, which means the right to vote in political elections. So next slide. The fight to have the vote first started by Millicent Fawcett, who is the founder of the National Union of Women's Suffrage, which started in 1897. She was the leader of this group for over 50 years. Millicent Fawcett believed in peaceful protesting and using logical argument was the way to get the vote, and believed any kind of violent acts would deter men from trusting them with the vote. She concentrated a lot more on improving women's education, specifically on women's rights. She argued that because women paid taxes and so did men, they should have equal rights and the equal right to vote. She also argued that as a woman that had to abide by the law created by the government, they should have a say in who is governing. Next slide. So as the movement for the women's vote wasn't going anywhere, many women were left upset, angry, and disheartened. So in 1903, the Women's Social and Political Union was founded by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters, Sylvia and Christabel. This union is now known as the Suffragettes. Emmeline Pankhurst was the leader of the Suffragettes for 40 years and achieved her dream of gaining the vote in the year of her death in 1928. Next slide. Millicent and Emily had a lot in common, from social background to being left widowed at quite a young age. Although they both wanted the same thing for women, to gain the vote, they didn't see eye to eye on how to raise awareness. Emily Pankhurst was fearless and radical and immediately started to use violence and aggression to protest. The first 2 years of the Women's Social and Political Union started out peaceful, but just like the National Union of Women's Suffrage, time went on and not a lot was happening, and no one was really paying attention to what they were trying to say. Emily Pankhurst and her daughters believed that peaceful protesting wouldn't get them anywhere, which was clear to see after 2 years of barely any movement. Next slide. They chose to turn violent and extreme anger, as they believed that deeds, not words, would get them heard. Their motto was deeds, not words, and that was very common for all suffragettes to use. Many suffragettes would use incredibly aggressive tactics to get people to listen, such as planting bombs, breaking windows, handcuffing themselves to railings, and going on hunger strikes when they were arrested. And then in 1905, Anna Kenny and Christabel Pankhurst took the very first step towards a more vocal and radical movement. They interrupted a meeting between two politicians, which at the time was crazy because when politicians were speaking, everybody would just sit and listen, no matter if you agreed or didn't agree with what they had to say. So they asked both politicians if they believed that asked if they believed women had the right to vote. Neither of them spoke up, and so they just got out banners and posters saying votes for women and continued to shout at them until they answered the question. Both of these women were thrown out of the meeting and arrested. Although they were offered the opportunity to pay a fine instead of jail time, they both decided on taking jail time to gain publicity for the campaign. After this very first protest, the whole campaign became incredibly vocal and progressively violent. Many women who were involved with the cause were given harsher penalties from authorities so they wouldn't get involved in the movement. Next slide. Emily Davidson, who was a big part of the women's movement, was a British activist, part of the suffragette movement. And in 1906, she joined the Women's and Social Political Union, and then 3 years later, quit her full-time job of teaching to become a full-time protester and be really involved in the movement. And Emily was an incredibly passionate person and dedicated member. She had a number of arrests and a lot of jail time. Um, and as a way of getting back at the government, as a way of getting back, a way of getting back at the government. Every time she was in jail, she would go on hunger strikes. So she would be released early because they didn't want to keep women who were starving in jail, and they didn't want to have to deal with that. So they would often let women out a lot earlier if they went on hunger strikes. And then on June 4th, 1913, Emily attended the Epsom Derby as another part of protesting for women's vote. And as the race started, she ran onto the race and she got hit by a horse and a jockey in protest of trying to get the vote. And she unfortunately died 4 days later from her injuries. But like she gave her life to the movement and she took her life specifically to get attention for the movement. And after years and years and years of fighting, finally, and 15 years later, after Emily Davidson's tragic death, an act was passed allowing women to vote on the same terms as men. So her life being lost luckily came back to something good. And yeah, that's all about the suffragettes. And I'll let Emma talk now.
Okay. So over in the United States, the feminist movement and women's suffrage was also taking hold. So by the mid-19th century, feminist ideas were being exchanged across Europe and North America, although the women's right to vote was not granted in the United States until 1920, which was many years later. So the abolition of slavery, which took place in the mid-19th century, was the key for feminist activism to take hold. Female abolitionists sought to apply the same concepts of freedom and equality to their own social and political situations. Many American activists came into contact with female abolitionists from England who were reaching the same conclusions. So by the mid-19th century, issues surrounding feminism and abolitionism were simultaneously contributing to the changing society in North America. The 15th Amendment was passed in 1869, which was following the abolition of slavery a couple of years earlier, and this gave black men the right to vote. Feminists who had supported the abolition of slavery expected the amendment to include women also, and they were disappointed and outraged when it didn't. This prompted huge conflict and caused women to band into similar suffragette groups that they'd heard about in England, who were also protesting heavily. By 1900, Eastern European immigrants had flooded into North America and the growth of urban slums had begun. So this American passion for equity and fairness that was sparked through the abolition sort of dampened, and Americans weren't really keen for freedom anymore. So the suffragist leaders leaped onto this shift of focus. They began appealing for the vote on racist grounds, declaring that the votes of literate, American-born, middle-class women would balance the votes of foreigners. This elitist and classist attitude widened the divide between feminist organisers and the masses of American women who lived in the slums, who weren't white or spoke with foreign accents. Finally, when the 19th Amendment was added to the American Constitution, black and white women were finally allowed to vote as well. And this happened around the same time as it did in England. So white women were able to cast their votes proudly in the next election, although women of colour were met with hostility, dismissiveness, and outright refusal. So many southern states imposed grandfather clauses that ensured that descendants of slaves weren't allowed to vote even though they were free people. Other states around the country subjected voters to literacy tests, which administered differently to white recipients or black recipients. Often, even when black voters overcame these hurdles, they learnt that they had accumulated years of unpaid poll taxes, all of which had to be paid before they could cast a ballot. These tests and obstacles disproportionately disenfranchised black Americans and were designed to revoke their civil rights, even after they'd won the vote. In the eyes of the African American, white oppressors were white oppressors, regardless if they were female or male. All of these societal issues further perpetuated the difference between white feminists and those of colour. So, the divide between white feminists and non-white feminists was sparked early on because of all these issues and would only deepen as time passed. In 1989, a black feminist scholar, Kimberly Crenshaw, who we can see here, she coined the term to describe this division, intersectionality. It began as a theory to explore the oppression of black women within society and how radical feminist movements ignore the multi-layered experience it is to be both a woman and to be black at the same time. The analysis has since expanded and now includes perspectives of social identity such as race, gender, sexuality, class, and ability. So intersectionality can be used as an analytical tool to explore and understand modern feminist movements such as March for Her and Black Lives Matter, which I think Yvette and Michaela are going to talk about later. Before the coin was termed, the idea behind intersectionality was famously discussed by the African American former slave Sojourner Truth. So she spoke before the Women's Rights Convention in 1851, which is like a good 70 years before women even gained the right to vote. And she delivered her famous speech, Ain't I a Woman? The speech explores classism, racism, and sexism and symbolises this difference between white women of a high social class and women of colour once again. So she said one of her most famous parts of her quote or her speech was, "That man over there says that woman needs to be helped into carriages, lifted over ditches, and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place, and ain't I a woman?" So she's really just exploring this idea that because she's a black woman, she doesn't get the same advantages that women do, white women do. So many years later on, other black feminists have explored the contentious relationship between white feminists and women of colour. So white feminists define gender as the principal source of their exclusion from society, while black women were forced to figure out how to make black men think about gender issues, while also making white women think about racial issues. White women have proven their assumption that they were unified by a common oppressor, the patriarchy, by getting the vote, while many black women have a difficulty seeing white women as their feminist sisters, because in their eyes, white people were their oppressors, regardless if they were male or female. Other important black feminists have explored the relationship between race and gender issues, and the subject is still greatly debated in modern feminism, which I think Yvette is going to talk about now. They're my references.
Cool, thank you. So women's rights movements in modern society differs greatly from the past, and this is due to the development of digital technology. Through the growth of the digital age, people across the globe are gaining access to a platform of knowledge through developments including the internet and social media. These developments allow for a rapid transfer of information and connection that has the ability to cross all borders and boundaries. By using these platforms, groups of individuals who may have not had access to information in the past due to factors such as class, race, or gender, now have the power to become educated, empowered, and heard. When we look at women's rights movements prior to the 21st century, we can see how accessibility was limited to a select few. If we fast forward to feminist movements in modern society, we see how these movements are trying to aim to provide accessibility and equality for all. It is not just about gender-based inequality, but breaking down other inequalities that women can face due to their race, class, ability, and sexuality. Next slide. A perfect example of a modern women's rights movement is March for Justice. The founders of this movement understand and acknowledge that all inequality is not created equal, and the fight for women's rights still continues to this day. March for Justice is campaigning against gendered violence by providing a petition to Australian Parliament that demands action. The movement was formed after recent rape allegations against parliamentary figures. To be specific, March for Justice is fighting for a few things. The first being a full independent investigation into all cases of gendered violence and timely referrals to appropriate authorities with full public accountability for findings. To fully implement the 55 recommendations in the Australian Human Rights Commission's Respect at Work report and the National Inquiry into Sexual Harassment in Australian Workplaces in 2020. To lift public funding for gendered violence and prevention to the world's best practice, and the enactment of a Federal Gender Equality Act to promote gender equality. It should include a gender equity audit of parliamentary practices. The movement took place in all Australian capital cities and regional towns on the 15th of March 2021. Its aim is to address and end sexism, misogyny, dangerous workplace cultures, and the lack of equality in politics and the community at large. Next slide. So another movement which gained great momentum due to digital technology is Me Too. Me Too was originally created by activist Tarana Burke to support victims of sexual misconduct, specifically focusing on young girls of colour. However, it did not become globally known until the social media Me Too movement took off in the United States in 2017. This happened when actress Alyssa Milano took to Twitter to request that her followers tweet the hashtag #MeToo if they had ever been assaulted or sexually harassed. Milano at the time was unaware of Burke's Me Too movement. After 24 hours had passed, Milano had posted the tweet. The hashtag had been posted 500,000 times. A majority of the responses focused on events that had taken place within a workplace setting. This shows us how digital technology can be used to rapidly spread a message worldwide within hours. The main focus and idea behind the Me Too movement was to form a connection between victims and to show the prevalence and magnitude of assault and sexual harassment across the globe. Without social movements like Me Too, without the power of connection through the internet and social media, victims would not have the courage to stand up against their perpetrators. Next slide. From the Me Too movement, which sparked conversations and awareness around the globe, the Time's Up initiative was born. Created by Hollywood insiders, the Time's Up is focusing on sexual harassment and inequality in the workplace as well. It extends to all, including groups that focus on providing support to minorities such as gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and transgender individuals. Time's Up works to provide resources on sexual harassment and how to address it, whilst also raising money to help those in need to gain access to legal support. And it works with lawyers to provide pro bono assistance so that victims can pursue their claims. Since the fund launched in January 2018, within a year, it had raised over $24 million and connected 3,677 people with attorneys to pursue possible legal action. Initiatives such as Time's Up are working towards closing the gaps in our society that prevent minorities from being heard and supported. When we reflect on modern feminist movements, we can see that they are giving everyday individuals a voice that can be heard and shared through the use of social media. No longer do you have to be a person in a position of power to have the ability to spread a powerful message. And now Michaela's going to talk some more. Thank you.
Thank you. So currently today, Black women are being constrained of their civil rights due to the mistreatment that they are currently experiencing. The exclusion between white and Black women dates back earlier in the days of the history. While both Black and white women participated in the civil rights movement, it didn't promote a sense of unity among them. Black women are the subject that makes them the victim due to their colour of their skin, which creates racial discrimination. Currently, Black women are the ones being targeted, making it seem that their rights are being taken away. These are a variety of organisations in the 21st century that are helping to promote Black women's rights. Next slide, please. So Say Her Name is a campaign which started in 2014 after several Black women were killed by police. It was created to raise awareness and allow individuals to hear the story of women and girls that were killed by law enforcement officers. Innocent women and girls that were killed as young as 7 years and as old as 93. Say Her Name discusses Black women's encounters with police violence, which helps to support a gender-inclusive approach that prioritises all Black lives equally. It's through the documentation that the African American Policy Forum, that it's hopeful that it will be used to unite the social justice movement around the stories of Black women today who have died as a result of police violence. According to the policy, all women which were stopped by police in New York were 13.4% white and 53.3% Black, which is shocking. All Black people experience racial profiling while driving. Many of these deaths have occurred while being in a car. Kendra James was shot in the head by a police officer after trying to remove her from the driver's seat of a car. The police officer shot James after trying to remove her. He claimed it was self-defense because the vehicle was moving while his body was partially inside the car. It was cleared of all charges related to her death by the federal jury. This is just one person's story, but there are many more stories out there which relate to the same issue. These are just some names down the bottoms of more girls who have lost their lives. The next slide, please. Black Lives Matter movement started in 2013. It began through an online movement by using a hashtag Black Lives Matter on social media. This was funded by 3 Black women in response to the death of a Black man. These women came together to recognize the mistreatment of Black people. The main goal in Black Lives Matter is to raise awareness towards the many ways in which Black people are being treated differently in society at the moment, which leads to unfairness. It wasn't until 2020 which created a widespread of individuals from all around the world starting to use the hashtag Black Lives Matter after George Floyd, an unarmed man, was pronounced dead after a police officer was kneeling on him, causing him to stop breathing. Since the expansion of Black Lives Matter in 2014, there has been several different protests in the name of Black Lives Matter, which drew national and international attention to those deaths. This focuses on the deaths of people which should be on the hands of the police, such as Breonna Taylor. Black Lives Matter currently has a website where individuals can go to visit and gain information about the history with different resources which are available for viewing. Also giving people the option to contribute by donating money to this movement. Next slide, please. So what can be done to make a difference? More needs to be done in today's society to make a difference and create equality with white and Black women. To make a difference, it's encouraged that all people of colour and race come together to change the way that Black women are being treated today. This can happen through donating money at Black Lives Matter, along with standing with other people during protests to assist in the creation of change. Furthermore, think about the way that you treat people and have a look and see if you're hurting someone else's feelings by the way that you're talking. And the next slide is just my references.
All right, and that's the end of our presentation.